we got a report from the New York Times this week with the Brooklyn Nets, who are currently 6-9. They're having a very good season. I don't really think too many people expected them to have the season that they're having currently. I know I didn't. I know a lot of media members that are much smarter than me. Uh, Basically had the Brooklyn Nets as one of the worst teams in basketball, but they're being competitive. And this is a direct report from the New York Times that the rebuilding Nets are expected to be open for business even with the competitive start, which in first year head coach Jordi Fernandez has made good use of the available players that he's had. So it had me thinking, and I looked at the Brooklyn Nets roster before I decided to record this podcast. There were four players that I looked at on their roster that I think most of you guys would be interested in. And we're going to talk about each one. And the first one that came to mind was Cam Johnson. This was a player last season, last summer, last free agency, right? That a lot of us had penciled in because we had just hired Monty Williams. Monty Williams was very familiar with Cam Johnson in Phoenix. He kind of would have been a good fit next to Cade Cunningham if you think about it. A 3-and-D wing, uh, a player that is not too old but not too young, could be a good vet for them. And Cam Johnson spoke really highly of Cade Cunningham and the Detroit Pistons in that same offseason with JJ Redick on a podcast. So he seemed like a player that I think a lot of you guys would be very interested in. Now, obviously, he did sign a pretty big contract to go with the Brooklyn Nets. And here's my thing. I think if the Pistons didn't have Tobias Harris, I'd be in. I think it would be very hard for the Detroit Pistons to land a Cam Johnson in a trade with the Brooklyn Nets just because they probably want a player that they feel that they can build with long term because they are going through a rebuild. And knowing the Nets, they would probably want a player like Jaden Ivey, which I think most of us would probably say absolutely not. I don't really think they would be interested in anyone outside of possibly a Jaden Ivey. I don't really know if they would want Anasar Thompson or Ron Holland because they have a player that's kind of a similar defender in Dorian Finney-Smith. Who knows what they do with him long term? But Cam Johnson looks nice on paper. If you're a Detroit Pistons fan, I just don't think you have the capital or the assets to get the Nets to trade Cam Johnson to you. But he's a player that piques my interest because I don't really know what the asking price may be. Maybe I'm a little bit off base here in terms of like what they possibly would want. Now, the second player I had was Dennis Schroder. Now, he's older. He plays point guard, and you may be, watching this or listening to this thing. Why the heck would we want Dennis Schroder? Well, Cade Cunningham, who knows how long he's going to be out. We'll get to his injury a little bit later, and we have a clip of what happened to him last night in Charlotte. But Dennis Schroeder's 31, pretty good point guard throughout his career. And he could possibly be a starting point guard if you need him to be a starting point guard or a veteran backup point guard, if you will. He's a very good guard. He's been one of the better under the radar point guards in the NBA for quite some time. I think anytime someone mentions his name, I think the first reaction was him rejecting all that money the Lakers gave him a few off seasons ago, and he had to sign for like a vet's minimum. Um, Anytime like I mention his name, I think that's the first thing people say. But I think he would be a player that I would be interested in, kind of given the lack of backup guard help we have on the bench in terms of just having a playmaker, another ball handler, a distributor. He could take some stress off, Jaden Ivey and Cade Cunningham down the stretch, or maybe you look to just put the ball in Dennis Schroeder's hands a little bit more often to try to cut down the turnovers with this team because they are still a very high turnover team. I don't look what they did against the Washington Wizards and the Chicago Bulls is sustainable. Just because they don't really put a lot of pressure on their ball handlers. I'm talking about, the Washington Wizards and the Chicago Bulls because they had 19 turnovers against the Charlotte Hornets. And I think that's more on theme with the Pistons. in terms of just the way they take care of the basketball because they don't. That's why I think Dennis Schroder would intrigue me just because he's a vet. He could help the young guards develop. Now, again, it depends what the Brooklyn Nets want. I don't know what they want for a Dennis Schroder. They probably want draft capital, or maybe they want some young players to build around. But he would definitely be a player that I would look at if I am a Detroit Pistons fan. Now, the third player I have on my list is Cam Thomas. Now, we made a video earlier this summer about Cam Thomas. It was a Bleacher Report article, if I remember correctly. And it was basically a trade for Jaden Ivey for Cam Thomas straight up. Obviously, that trade never went through. That trade was just, I think, a fan article. There was no real merit to it. But I'm glad the Pistons didn't make that trade because Jaden Ivey's just having such a phenomenal year. But Cam Thomas as a player, I think a lot of you guys would absolutely love. He's a guy that can score at all three levels. He's a guy that you give him the basketball, he's going to get you a bucket. He can take over games down the stretch. And that is something that I think a lot of us have talked about of just have a guy to take over the fourth quarter. Obviously, you'd like that to be Cade Cunningham or maybe Jaden Ivey. But for right now, in late November, we really don't have someone where we can give them the basketball and they can just take over the game. I think Cam Thomas is one of those players where if you need a bucket, he can get you a bucket. He can shoot threes at a pretty decent clip. Mid range is nice, can get to the free throw line. This scored all three levels. He's just an absolute bucket at the end of the day. Again, like what would Brooklyn want for a Cam Thomas? I don't know. I think they could possibly get a late first round pick for him. That's just how high I am on Cam Thomas. Maybe you guys are a little bit lower on him because defensively, um, it's I would say he's a passable defender at times, but he's not really known for his defense. He's more known for just being an absolute bucket. But he would definitely be a guy that I would be intrigued with. If I'm the Detroit Pistons, maybe you can try to buy low if Brooklyn doesn't feel too high on him, or maybe there's not a real market for him. But I think they could possibly get a late first. Even with this strong draft class, like Cam Thomas is just going to be an absolute problem for years to come for opposing defenses. Now, the last player I had on my list was Nick Claxton. Now, we talked about Nick Claxton a couple of times this past summer because the Pistons had the cap space to get him if they wanted to. Obviously, he got a pretty big deal, but if you look at his deal, it kind of declines as the years go on. Now, he has struggled a little bit defensively this year, but overall, he's a pretty good rim protector. He can throw him lobs, really good around the basket and the rim. And we've talked about our centers. We've talked about our bigs, struggling to protect the paint, struggling to close out defensively. I think Nick Claxton would be really fun in Detroit. Now, again, what would Brooklyn want for a Nick Claxton? Do you entertain possibly a Duran for a Claxton? I don't know. Probably not. I think the Pistons are still trying to figure out what they're going to do long term at center. I don't really think they've made a decision yet. But I would keep an eye on it, especially if you're a Piston fan, because I think they haven't found their franchise center yet. They're still tinkering with who the starting center is going to be. For right now, it's Jalen Duran, but if he doesn't pick it up defensively, I don't know how much longer he's going to be able to keep that starting center spot personally. But Nick Claxton would be a very interesting name to keep an eye on. I don't really know how high opposing teams would be on any of our young guys. Obviously every team would probably want a Cade Cunningham and even Jaden Ivey to an extent. But those are four guys that I'm looking at. Brooklyn is looking to just absolutely blow up their roster, get draft picks, and just start this rebuild, especially with a very good draft class with Cooper Flagg and Ace Bailey. Ace Bailey of late, man, he's just been heating up. Like he might have a conversation of who's going to get picked, him or Cooper Flagg, because he's just playing so damn well right now. But did want to bring it to your guys' attention. Brooklyn Nets are looking to have a fire sale. Maybe there's a player that I didn't even mention that you guys like on the Brooklyn Nets. Definitely, leave a comment as you're watching live or, leave a comment if you are listening on the audio side. But